The hall at Ashmore Park held its breath the way old houses do when something ancient is disturbed, when the dust of generations shifts without wind, when a name long buried rises through the floorboards and demands to be heard. She had not meant to say it so loudly. Nora Vane had meant to say nothing at all. She had meant to stand in the shadows behind the serving table with the other footman and the two housemaids, to keep her eyes at a careful angle below the chandelier's blaze, to endure the reading of the testament, as she had endured every other formal proceeding at Ashmore for the past 3 years, quietly, invisibly, with no more presence in the room than the candles on their stands. She had learned invisibility as a discipline. She had honed it until it felt like a skill she was proud of. She had told herself, on the mornings when the invisibility cost her most, that it was simply the shape of her life now, and that lives had many shapes, and that she was fortunate to have a shape at all. Then the solicitor had read the Crest clause. Then he had said that the seal of Ashmore, the engraved silver bearing the hawk and the 3 rivers, passed in perpetuity to the family of the house in the direct male line, and that, as no such heir existed within living knowledge, it would transfer upon the death of old Lord Fenwick Ashmore to his nearest legitimate relative, one Mr. Aldous Crewe. Crewe stood at the center of the room with his hands already assembled in the shape of ownership. He had arrived at Ashmore 4 days ago and had twice mispronounced the name of the village at the gate, and had called the housekeeper by the wrong name on 3 separate occasions, and had never once in his life heard of the hawk and the 3 rivers or known why they mattered. The Crest clause had still been hanging in the air when Nora said it. "That crest belongs to me by blood." She had not raised her voice. She had not needed to. The words carried simply because nothing else in the hall was making any sound, because every candle seemed to hold still, because the room had that quality that rooms acquire when the wrong sentence is spoken inside them, the quality of being unable to pretend the sentence had not been said. The room turned to look at her. Nora did not flinch. She was 24 years old, and she had been standing in that hall for 3 years, in a gray dress with its collar turned up against the drafts from the north wing windows. And she had spent those 3 years learning not to flinch. She held herself very straight, the way her father had taught her, the way the portrait above the mantelpiece held itself, the portrait of the woman with dark hair and river-gray eyes who had been painted at Ashmore in 1799 and whose name the family had stopped saying aloud years before Nora arrived to say her own. Standing in that hall, in the silence she had made, Nora understood for the first time that she had always known this moment would come. She had not known it consciously. Something in her body had known and had been waiting, and the waiting was now over. The man at the center of the room, the one who had come as Lord Westerby from the north, the one who had stood near the fireplace the entire reading, with his arms folded, and his face arranged into an expression Nora could not quite name. That man had not turned to look at her the way the rest of the room had turned. He had simply stopped moving. He went very still, the way water goes still when something drops into it from a great height, not disturbed yet, but aware that disturbance is coming. He was watching her. She could feel it without looking at him directly. She did not look at him directly. Not yet. "The girl is confused," said Lady Meredith Ashmore from her chair beside the fire. Nora had known Lady Meredith would be the first to speak. Lady Meredith had been speaking first at Ashmore for 40 years. She was 71 and wore her silver hair in the old style, dressed and pinned close to her head, and she kept her fan in her hand at all times, even in the depths of winter, as though she required the option of deploying it should anyone need to be dismissed. She had never dismissed Nora exactly. She had done something more thorough than that. She had simply arranged the world of the house so that Nora's presence in it was a kind of furniture. Useful, replaceable, beneath comment. She is a housemaid, Lady Meredith continued, addressing herself to the solicitor rather than to Nora, who has been with us for 3 years and has conducted herself adequately during that time. Whatever she believes she has to say about the succession of this house, I assure you, Mr. Farnham, it need not detain us. Nora looked at the solicitor. He was a small man with careful eyes, and he was looking back at her with an expression that was not dismissal. It was something more complicated than that. It was the expression of a man who had known a secret for a long time, and who had been waiting with rather more patience than Nora herself for someone to bring it into the light. Miss Vane, said Mr. Farnham, and the title alone was enough to still the room again, because she had not been called Miss Vane in 3 years. She had been called Nora, or girl, or you there, not Miss Vane. Would you care to explain what you mean? Nora set down the cloth she had been holding. She set it very carefully on the edge of the table. She smoothed the front of her gray dress once, not from vanity, but from the same instinct that makes one straighten a painting before entering a room where one's presence must count for something. My mother, she said, was Cecily Ashmore. Lord Fenwick Ashmore was her father. She left this house in 1798 after a marriage her father refused to sanction. She took nothing with her except a copy of the family registry and a miniature of the hawk and 3 rivers painted on ivory. I was born in 1802. I have both of those items upstairs in my room. The room did not move. The room did not breathe. Crewe said, his voice gone thin at the edges, "This is absurd." And Lady Meredith said nothing at all, which was the most alarming thing she had done in 3 years. If you have stayed with me this long, I think you already know that the hall's silence was not the silence of disbelief. It was the silence of recognition. It was the silence of a room that had kept a secret long enough that it had half forgotten the secret was there. And now the secret was standing in a gray dress by the serving table, and the room had to decide what to do with the fact that it had always known. Nora Vane had come to Ashmore not by accident. She had come by design, though a design so long in the making that it had begun to resemble patience rather than plan. Her mother had died when Nora was 16, and what she had left behind was not much in the material sense: a small cottage in a Shropshire village, a drawer of letters tied with faded ribbon, the family registry, and the ivory miniature with the hawk and 3 rivers etched in careful period detail. She had also left behind a name, her own maiden name, spoken once in Nora's presence as something between an apology and a gift. "You have Ashmore blood," her mother had said. "I want you to know it, and I want you to do with the knowing whatever you judge is right." Nora had judged nothing for some years. She had been too occupied with the business of surviving her mother's death, of managing the cottage and then losing the cottage when the lease expired, of finding herself at 19 with good education, a quiet manner, and no resources beyond the 2 objects in her pocket, and the name she had no proof anyone would credit. She had tried other positions first. The schoolmaster's household in Liverpool had been decent employment, orderly and not unkind, and she had stayed there 14 months and left it with her reference intact and her purpose still unformed. The widowed aunt in Bath had been a kinder woman than Nora expected, and they had sat together in the evenings reading from improving volumes while the aunt's cat occupied the hearthrug. And Nora had looked at the fire on those evenings and thought about the registry in the wooden box beneath her bed, and wondered what she was waiting for, and knew, without being able to name it precisely, that she was waiting for something to tell her she was ready. She was not yet ready in Liverpool. She was not yet ready in Bath. Something in her chest knew the difference between waiting and hiding, and she could feel by the end of the 2nd winter in Bath that she had been hiding long enough. She had come to Ashmore 3 years ago under her own name, which she knew would mean nothing to anyone. She had presented herself to the housekeeper as a woman seeking domestic service, had said she had experience and could supply a reference from the Bath household, and had been taken on without ceremony. She had not announced her connection to the house. She had not made claims she could not yet prove. She had simply entered the place where the proof lived, and she had waited, and she had worked, and she had learned the house from its foundations upward the way one learns a thing one already half knows, with the particular attention of recognition rather than novelty. What she had not anticipated in the planning of this long patience was Lord Damien Westerby. She had expected an executor in the legal sense, a man with documents and a hat on a peg, and a manner that signaled he had done this before, and expected to do it again. She had expected someone whose attention to the house would be administrative, whose attention to the servants would be absent in the way that authority often made people absent to those below them in the household order. She had prepared, over 3 years of preparation, for a great many things. She had not prepared for a man who, on his second morning at Ashmore, stood for 20 minutes in the passage outside the estate room, reading the shipping manifests nailed to the board there, with the focused patience of someone trying to understand a language they had not quite mastered, and then straightened and went into the estate room and did not emerge for 2 hours. He had arrived 6 weeks before old Lord Fenwick Ashmore's death, summoned in his capacity as a distant connection of the family, and, as the household gradually understood, as the executor of the estate. He was 31 years old. He had dark hair, worn short, and a jaw that the morning light in the library carved into something austere when he was reading, which he often was. He had a quality of stillness that Nora had noticed on his first evening at the house, when she had carried in the tea service and found him standing at the window of the east sitting room with the last light of October falling across his shoulder, not moving, simply looking at the grounds below as though he was calculating something that the grounds themselves could not supply him. He had not looked at her when she set down the tray. He had not looked at her the following morning when she had lit the fire in the library. He had not looked at her on any of the 6 occasions in the first 2 weeks when their paths had crossed in the ordinary conduct of the household. He had, however, stopped what he was doing each time she entered a room. Not visibly. Not in any way that could be cited as attention. Simply a pause. Brief and inexplicable. Like a clock that loses a half-second at intervals too irregular to be planned. Nora had not allowed herself to think about the pauses. She had too much else to think about. Lord Fenwick was dying, and dying slowly, and his decline made the house watchful and strange, and into this watchfulness Crewe had arrived with his claims and his mispronunciations, and his habit of standing in doorways, looking around rooms, as though he was already deciding what to remove from them. Nora had watched him watch the house, and had felt, for the first time, that her patience might be running out. That if she waited for the right moment, it might arrive after the moment when waiting was still an option. She had gone to the library on a Tuesday evening in the 3rd week of November, when she knew Lord Westerby would be there, because the library was where he spent his evenings, and because she had decided that before she spoke in the hall, she needed to know one thing. She had knocked. He had said, "Come in," and she had come in, and stood at the edge of the lamplight in her gray dress and said, "I beg your pardon for disturbing you, my lord. I wanted to ask whether you are familiar with the terms of the Ashmore family deed, as it pertains to direct blood succession." He had looked at her then. He had looked at her for a long moment, in which the fire in the hearth was the only thing in the room that moved, and his expression had done something she could not immediately classify. It had gone, very briefly, from the face he maintained in the general household to something else underneath it, something that was paying careful attention in a way that was not quite the attention one paid to a servant. "I am," he said. "Are you?" "I may have reason to be," she said. There was a silence. He set down his book, which she noticed was not a fashionable novel or a journal of estate management, but a volume of heraldic law she had not known the library possessed. "Sit down, Miss Vane," he said. She had not told him her surname yet. The use of it was the confirmation she had been looking for. He already knew, at least in part, what she had come to tell him. She sat. They had spoken for 2 hours that evening, and what passed between them was methodical and careful, and entirely concerned with genealogy and documentary evidence and the legal weight of a family registry in the presence of a formal succession dispute. It was not the conversation Nora had expected to have with a man who looked the way he looked in a library at 11 o'clock at night. It was also, in every way that mattered, exactly the conversation she needed. If she had permitted herself to think about him afterwards, alone in her room with the miniature on the table beside her, she would have noted that his voice, when he was being precise, had a quality of restraint that was not coldness, but its opposite, a kind of controlled warmth held in check by the discipline of the task. She would have noted that he had not once suggested she was wrong. He had asked for the evidence, and she had described it, and he had listened with the focused patience of a man who took the law seriously. And in the course of the conversation he had said, with his eyes on the fire rather than on her face, "If the registry and the miniature are what you describe, they are sufficient." She had not let herself think about that evening too carefully. She had too much else to do. Old Lord Fenwick Ashmore died on the 1st of December, quietly and in the morning, with the frost still white on the east lawn. The household went into mourning. The funeral was held 5 days later. The reading of the testament was arranged for the 7th, and Crewe arrived on the 3rd with his assumptions already assembled and his hands already shaped. Nora had stood in the hall at the reading and said what she said, and the hall had gone quiet. And now she was standing in the silence of it, with his thin objection still hanging in the air, and Lady Meredith still saying nothing. "I should like to see the items you described," said Mr. Farnham. "I will bring them now," said Nora. "You need not leave the room," said Lord Westerby. He crossed the floor. Not hurriedly, because there was nothing in his bearing that admitted hurry, but directly, with the economy of a man who has already decided on his course. He crossed the floor and went to the corridor door and opened it, and spoke briefly to someone in the passage. And then he came back, and stood slightly nearer to Nora than the formal geometry of the room would have suggested. Not close enough to be commented upon. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the gray wool of her dress. 2 minutes later, Mrs. Holt, the housekeeper, appeared in the doorway with a small wooden box. She set it on the table before the solicitor, without looking at Lady Meredith. Nora noticed that Mrs. Holt's hands were steady, and that she did not seem surprised. She understood, in that moment, that the housekeeper had known, that there had been, perhaps, one ally in this house she had not known she had. The registry was wrapped in oilcloth. The miniature was wrapped in a square of flannel. Mr. Farnham opened them both with the deliberate care of a man who understood that how he handled objects in the next few minutes would matter for a long time. The room watched him. Every face in the room was turned toward the table except two. Crewe was watching Nora with the expression of a man rearranging a situation he had believed settled. And Lord Westerby was watching Crewe. "The registry is in the Ashmore hand," said Mr. Farnham. He turned 3 pages with a careful finger. "This entry, Cecily Ashmore, born 1779, daughter of Fenwick Ashmore and his first wife, Harriet. She does not appear in the estate records I was given because she left the house in 1798, and her father refused to acknowledge the marriage." He paused. However, he turned another page. This, in a different hand, added later, "Miss Cecily Ashmore, upon reflection and with acknowledgement of Christian duty, is recognized as lawful daughter, and her issue as lawful issue of this house." The room had stopped breathing again. "Who added that entry?" said Aldous Crewe. "Lord Fenwick Ashmore," said Mr. Farnham. "Within the past year, I should judge from the ink." After which he arranged the terms of the testament to include the Crest clause. Lady Meredith closed her fan. It was the smallest possible sound, and it carried an enormous weight. "He knew," she said, "not to anyone in particular. Anyone in. She was looking at the fire. He knew she was here." Nora said nothing. She had known or suspected for some months. Old Lord Fenwick had never spoken to her about it. He had, twice in his final weeks, looked at her across a room with an expression she had not understood at the time. She understood it now. He had looked at her the way one looks at a person one owes a debt one cannot immediately pay, and he had paid it in the only way he had left, in ink, in a registry she had not known he had seen. That was the moment Nora's composure came closest to leaving her. Not in the hall when the room had turned to stare. Not in the library when Lord Westerby had said, "Sit down." Now, in the knowledge that an old man she had served without acknowledgement had seen her anyway, and had done what he could. Her eyes had gone bright. She kept them steady. The succession was settled, not that day, for these things do not settle in an afternoon, but in the days that followed, through correspondence with the solicitor's office in London, and through the examination of the registry by a specialist in heraldic documentation who came down from London on the 5th day and spent 3 hours at the correspondence table in the morning room with a magnifying glass and a notepad, and said very little while he worked. Nora sat at the opposite end of the table during the examination, upright and still, answering the questions put to her in a voice she kept level by the same discipline she had used in the hall. Mr. Farnham conducted the second formal interview himself, alone with Nora in the morning room on the 7th. With the specialist's preliminary findings already in hand, he asked her about the marriage her mother had entered, the man Cecily Ashmore had married, a clergyman's son from Shropshire whose name was Thomas Vane, and whether there was any documentation of that marriage. There was, she told him. There were 2 letters from her mother to her father that named the date and the church and the clergyman who had performed the ceremony, and the cottage lease, which bore her mother's name as Mrs. Thomas Vane. Mr. Farnham made notes. He was a thorough man and a just one, and she had trusted him from the moment in the hall when he had called her Miss Vane. Crewe departed Ashmore on the 10th of December, which was a Thursday. He said very little upon leaving. He had the look of a man who had arrived at a scene of ordinary claimed property and discovered the ground already occupied, and who had not yet worked out what to do with that discovery. He did pause at the door of the hall and look back once, at the portraits above the mantelpiece, the line of Ashmore faces in their oils, and then he looked at Nora, who was standing by the east window, and his expression was not precisely hostile. It was the expression of a man encountering, for the first time, the experience of being simply wrong about what the world owed him. She met his gaze steadily. She did not pursue the matter. She had no interest in the defeat of Crewe. She had interest only in the place where she was standing, and in the fact that she was now permitted to stand there without apology. Lady Meredith did not leave. Nora had not expected her to, and did not want her to. She was a woman of 71 who had been at Ashmore for 40 years, and whose connection to the house was as genuine as Nora's, even if its nature was different, and Nora had no interest in displacing anyone. She had interest in belonging. There was a distinction, and she held it carefully. On the morning after Crewe's departure, Nora was in the east sitting room reviewing the estate correspondence when Lord Westerby came in. He had that quality he always had at that hour, a kind of contained attention, as though the morning was something he was taking seriously. He closed the door behind him without making a point of it, and stood for a moment, looking at the room. "The London office is confirmed," he said. "You will have the formal documentation by the end of the month." "Thank you," said Nora. There was a silence. A good silence, or at least a considered one. The fire had been lit, and the east lawn beyond the window was very white. "You have been here 3 years," he said. "Yes." "Waiting." "Working," she said. "And waiting." He looked at her with the expression that was not coldness. "How much did you know when you arrived?" "That I had a right to be here," she said. "I did not know what right, or whether it could be established, or whether I would find the courage to try. I knew that if I did not try, I would always wonder." "And you found the courage," he said. "I found the moment," she said. "I think they are different things." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Crest, the Hawk, and the 3 rivers. Yes." "Your mother painted the miniature?" "No," said Nora. "The house painter did, in 1799. My mother commissioned it before she left. She wanted something of the house she could carry. She kept it her entire life, and she left it to me, and I have carried it my entire adult life." She paused. "It is not an especially fine painting. It is mine." "Yes," he said. "It is." There was another silence, longer than the first, and in it something shifted between them in the way that things shift in the east sitting room of an old house on a December morning, without announcement, without ceremony, in the manner of something that has been building long enough that its arrival is less an event than a recognition. He was still standing near the door. She was still at the correspondence table. The distance between them was proper and correctly maintained, and she was aware of every inch of it, in the way one is aware of a held breath. "You looked at me," she said, "on the evening of your second day in the house, in the library. I had brought in the tea service." "I know," he said. "You stopped what you were doing." "I know that also," he said. "And then you did not look at me again, for 2 weeks." He was quiet. "I thought," she said, "that you had decided not to." "I had decided," he said, "that looking was not something I could do with precision in your particular case, and precision seemed important, given the circumstances." Nora considered this for a moment. "That is a great deal of restraint," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am aware." If she had permitted herself, in the following days, to catalogue the specific qualities of Lord Westerby's restraint, she would have produced a considerable list. His restraint in the library, that first evening of their 2-hour conversation, when he had been careful not to let the matter of her situation tip into anything other than the factual. His restraint at the reading in the hall, when he had stood and gone still and had not moved until the precise moment he was needed. His restraint now, this morning, standing near the door of the east sitting room with the December light on his face and his hands at his sides, and everything he was not saying arranged in the space between them, with the particularity of objects placed deliberately on shelves. She did not allow herself to catalogue it too carefully. She had the Ashmore matter to attend to, and December was not a month that permitted sentiment without cost. She thought about his hands at his sides. He returned to London on the 14th for the holiday period, and Ashmore settled into its winter quiet. Nora managed the correspondence and the household accounts with Mrs. Holt, who had become, in the weeks since the haul, something between an ally and a quiet friend. Mrs. Holt had been at Ashmore for 30 years. She had known Cecily Ashmore by sight, she said, when Cecily was a young woman in the house before the quarrel. She did not say much else about it, but she said it with the tenderness of someone who had kept a thing carefully. "Your mother had a way of looking at the grounds," Mrs. Holt said one afternoon, and then seemed to decide she had said enough. Nora did not press her. She went to the window instead and looked at the east lawn, which was bare now, the frost gone, a thin December rain covering the stone of the drive in a flat gray sheen. She thought about her mother in this house as a young woman. She thought about what it had cost her to leave, and what it had cost her to stay away, and what it meant that she had given Nora, before she died, not only the evidence, but the knowledge that the evidence was worth using. The formal documentation arrived on the 22nd of December, as Mr. Farnham had promised. Nora read it at the correspondence table in the east sitting room, with the winter light coming through the window, and the fire behind her, and the hawk and the 3 rivers on the seal at the top of the page. And she held herself very still until she had read it twice, and then she set it down and looked at the east lawn for a long time. Lord Westerby returned to Ashmore on the 23rd. She did not expect him. The household was not formally expecting a guest, and the matter of his return was not announced. He simply arrived in the late afternoon with snow beginning on the drive, and came into the house, and went to the library, and Nora learned of it from a footman who mentioned in passing that Lord Westerby's horse had been stabled. She stayed in the east sitting room. She was not going to go to the library. She went to the library at 7:30. He was reading. The fire was very good, and the smell of the library at Ashmore in winter, old leather and cold stone and wood smoke, was the smell she had fallen in love with on her first morning in the house. He did not look up when she entered, but the quality of his stillness changed, the same half-second shift she had been noticing for 6 weeks. And she stood for a moment just inside the door and let herself acknowledge, for the first time, that she had been noticing. "I received the documentation," she said. "I know," he said. "Farnham wrote to me as well." "You came back." "The roads will be poor by Christmas," he said, which was not an answer. She came further into the room. She stood at the edge of the lamplight, the fire on the left side of her face, the lamp on the right, and between them the warmth of the room and the smell of the room, and Lord Westerby not looking at her from his chair with a precision she found, suddenly, almost more than she could manage. "I owe you a debt," she said. "You handled the matter in that hall with great care, and you managed Crewe's departure without incident, and you were, before any of this, the one who asked me to sit down when sitting down was exactly what I needed. You do not owe me a debt," he said. He set his book down. "I am the executor of this estate. What I did was my function. Your function did not require you to stand next to me in that hall," she said. He was quiet. "Your function did not require you to know my surname before I told it to you." He looked at her then. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the library 6 weeks ago, with the fire making the austere lines of his face into something less controlled, something with the quality of want in it, that he had been managing for longer than 6 weeks. She thought. A great deal longer. And now it was December, and there was snow on the drive, and the documentation was signed, and there was nothing, formally, between them that required management anymore. "No," he said. "It did not require that." She did not move. He did not move. The fire made a small sound. "You knew," she said. "Before the hall. You had already found the registry entry. In October," he said, "when I arrived and began the estate review. I did not know what to do with what I found, because what I found was a servant in this house, who was conducting herself with a composure I could not account for. And the more I observed her, the less I was able to account for it on the grounds of mere temperament. He looked at the fire. I handled it incorrectly. I should have come to you directly. You were being careful, she said. I was, he said. I am not entirely certain, in retrospect, that the care I was exercising was entirely about the legal matter. A silence settled between them. Outside, the snow had intensified. She could see it through the tall library windows, falling in the lamplight, very white against the December dark. She took 3 steps across the room. She was not thinking precisely about the 3 steps. She was thinking about what it meant to have come all this way, all 3 years of this particular kind of waiting, and to be standing now in the Ashmore Library with the documentation signed and the hawk and the 3 rivers confirmed, and a man watching her from a chair with the look of someone who has been holding something in reserve for longer than is comfortable. She stopped an arm's length from his chair. Damien, she said. And his name in her mouth, without the title, was the kind of small transgression that the Regency world took seriously, and she meant it to be taken seriously, and he knew it. He stood. He was taller than the chair made him, and the fire on his left side and the lamp on his right. And he was looking at her with the composed intensity she had been watching across 6 weeks of carefully maintained distance, and she was aware of his hand rising, slowly, toward hers. His fingers closed around her wrist. Not her hand, not yet. Her wrist, where the pulse was, where the warmth was, where the body told the truth that the composure would not. She felt him feel it. The pulse. Nora, he said, and it was a different thing entirely from Miss Vane. It was the marked thing, the thing that could not be walked back from, and she was glad of it. I am not a servant, she said. Any longer. No, he said, you are not. She did not let herself think too carefully about what happened next. Later, alone in what was now formally her room rather than a maid's room, she would allow herself to think about it. The fire behind them both, and the lamp on the table, and his hand at her wrist, and the snow falling past the tall windows, and the library smelling of old leather and wood smoke, and the Ashmore winter. A kiss that was small and certain and full of everything that 3 years of patience had been quietly accumulating. The kind of kiss that a house like Ashmore earns, eventually, if it is patient enough, is patient. She did not let herself think about it yet. She stood in the library for a while longer, with the fire and the snow and the hawk and the 3 rivers on the page of the documentation that she had brought without quite meaning to. And she thought instead about her mother, who had loved this house from a distance her whole life, and who had given Nora the one thing she needed to come back to it. Christmas came into Ashmore quietly that year. Lady Meredith presided over the table with the careful dignity of a woman who had adjusted her understanding of several things and was not yet ready to discuss the adjustment aloud, but who had, on the morning of the 24th, addressed Nora directly by her correct title for the first time since the hall. It was a small gesture, and Lady Meredith made nothing of it, but Nora understood its weight and received it accordingly. Mrs. Holt had put pine on the mantelpieces. The hall smelled of it for 3 days, and the smell was mixed with wood smoke and the particular cold damp of Ashmore's old walls, and to Nora, it was the smell of arriving somewhere that had been waiting for her to arrive. On the afternoon of the 24th, while Nora was reviewing the winter accounts in the east sitting room, Mrs. Holt knocked and entered and set a cup of tea on the table beside her, without being asked. She stood for a moment afterward, which she rarely did. Mrs. Holt was not a woman who lingered. "Your mother had a way with the east sitting room," she said. "She would take her embroidery frame in here on winter afternoons when the light was good. I could not have been more than a girl in the household then. I still remember the way she sat at that window." Nora looked at the window. The east lawn was beginning to darken at its edges with the early December afternoon. "Was she happy here?" she said. "I think she was when she was young," said Mrs. Holt. "And I think she would have been glad to know you came." She did not say anything further. She picked up a piece of folded linen from the chair arm and went out, closing the door with the quiet certainty of someone who knows when a conversation has given what it was meant to give. The documentation sat on the correspondence table in the east sitting room, the hawk and the 3 rivers at the top of the page. On the morning of the 25th, before the household assembled, she stood at the east window and looked at the grounds below, white and still and very quiet. The same grounds her mother had looked at when she was young, before the quarrel, before the leaving, before the long distance that Nora had crossed by coming here and waiting, and finally, in a hall full of people who did not expect it, saying the thing that had always been true. Lord Westerby appeared at her shoulder, not touching, standing close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, the contained attention he turned on the morning the same way he turned it on everything, as though nothing in the world deserved to be regarded carelessly. "What are you thinking?" he said. She thought about it honestly, the way she had learned to think about things that mattered. "I am thinking," she said, "that it is a very fine prospect for a woman who intended to spend her life looking at it from the servants' passage." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the quality of something almost like amusement in his voice, which she had not heard before, and which she understood immediately to be significant, "It is considerably finer from this angle." She did not answer. She had said enough in that hall for 1 month, and she could afford to let some things rest in silence. The east lawn lay below them, white and unmarked, and the hawk and the 3 rivers held their place on the page behind her. And Ashmore was very quiet, and the snow that had fallen through the night was the kind that stays. If you felt the weight of Nora's long patience lift at last, I would be glad to know it. Leave a word in the quiet below this story, and the warmth of it will carry forward. The miniature of the hawk and the 3 rivers stood on the mantelpiece in the east sitting room now, the flannel wrapper folded beside it. Nora had put it there on the morning of the 23rd, the morning after the documentation arrived, without ceremony or announcement. It had stood there through Christmas and into the New Year, catching the firelight in the afternoons, the ivory a little darkened with age, the engraving fine and careful. Her mother had carried it her whole life. She had carried it from Ashmore and across 30 years, and into the small cottage in Shropshire. And she had looked at it on the evenings when looking at it was the only thing that connected her to where she had come from. She had given it to Nora with the registry and the name and the knowledge, and Nora had carried it in turn, and now it was home. It was a small painting. It was not especially fine. It stood where it belonged, in the east sitting room of Ashmore Park, in the light of the fire, in the house whose blood it named. Nora left it there,